Wyoming Territory, 1872. The wind was a constant, a lonely voice that swept down from the jagged peaks of the Tetons and across the high plains. It carried the scent of pine and distant snow, and it scoured the land, leaving behind little more than sagebrush, hardy grasses, and a profound silence. For Caleb Thorne, that silence was not an emptiness to be filled, but a fortress to be maintained. From the porch of his ranch house, a sturdy structure of hewn logs he had built with his own two hands, he watched the world with a quiet, unwavering vigilance. His world was one of order, of fences mended and cattle counted, of sunrises that promised work and sunsets that brought a weary, solitary peace. He ran a hand over the rough sawn wood of the porch railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the endless blue of the sky met the muted greens and browns of the earth. His hands were calloused and capable, hands that knew the heft of an axe, the pull of reins, and the cold, unforgiving stock of a rifle. He was a man carved from the same hard materials as the land itself, his features weathered by sun and sorrow, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. At 34, he had already lived one lifetime and was now enduring another, a life defined by the deliberate absence of connection. Attachments, he had learned in the cruelest way possible, were vulnerabilities. They were cracks in the armor a man needed to survive out here. Love was a ghost he had buried alongside his wife, Sarah, and their infant son, Samuel, 5 years ago. The fever had taken them in the space of a single, brutal week, and with them, it had taken the part of him that knew how to hope. Now he lived by a simple, rigid code: a man survives alone. The ranch was his sanctuary and his prison. Every corner of it held a memory he fought to suppress. The way the morning light used to catch in Sarah's hair as she stood in the doorway. The phantom weight of his son sleeping against his chest. He had built these walls to protect a family, and now they served only to wall in his grief. The work was his salvation. It was a physical ache that could, for a time, overwhelm the spiritual one. He threw himself into it from dawn until dusk, seeking an exhaustion so complete that it left no room for thought or memory. His nearest neighbors were miles away, and his trips into the fledgling town of Redemption were brief, transactional affairs for supplies and nothing more. He was a known figure, respected for his competence and feared for his unapproachable demeanor. The townsfolk knew his story, or parts of it, and they gave him a wide berth, their pity and curiosity a palpable thing he could feel on his skin. He was in the middle of replacing a warped board on the corral fence, the rhythmic strike of his hammer the only sound in the vast stillness when he heard it. Faint at first, a mournful cry carried on the wind, it grew steadily stronger. A train whistle. It was an alien sound in his world of natural noises, a sharp, metallic intrusion that spoke of the outside world, of distant cities and countless people, of everything he had left behind. The twice-weekly train to Redemption was the town's lifeline and, for Caleb, a periodic reminder of the civilization he had forsaken. Its arrival meant mail, supplies, and sometimes new faces, faces that brought with them the potential for complication and disruption. He finished hammering the board into place, his movements precise and economical, his jaw set. He needed salt and flour, and the train's arrival was as good a time as any to make the necessary trip. He tried to ignore the knot of unease that tightened in his gut, a premonition as formless and persistent as the ever-present wind. He saddled his horse, a powerful roan named Atlas, and rode toward the sound, toward the town, toward the inevitable disruption of his carefully constructed peace. The town of Redemption was little more than a single, wide street carved out of the dust, flanked by a collection of raw timber buildings with false fronts that tried, and failed, to project an air of permanence. There was a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a livery stable, and the small, important building that served as both the train station and the sheriff's office. Dust, stirred by the wind and the hooves of horses, swirled in golden phantoms through the air, coating everything in a fine, gritty layer. As Caleb rode into town, The train was just hissing to a stop, a great black beast of iron and steam breathing out its exhaustion. A small crowd had gathered on the platform, ranch hands hoping for mail, the sheriff keeping a watchful, a few women from the town looking for a moment of distraction. Caleb tied Atlas to the hitching post in front of the general store, his eyes scanning the scene with habitual caution. He saw Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary competence he respected, nodding in his direction. Caleb gave a curt nod back. He planned to get his supplies and be gone before the last of the passengers had even disembarked. But his gaze, against his will, was drawn to the platform. People were stepping down from the passenger car, a mix of weary travelers and hopeful settlers. And then he saw her. She was a stark, impossible contrast to the grit and grime of redemption. Even from a distance, she stood out like a wildflower in a field of stone. She descended the steep steps of the train car with a careful grace, her gloved hand resting lightly on the rail. Her dress was the color of a summer sky, a fine blue wool that, while travel-worn and dusty at the hem, spoke of a different world entirely, a world of paved streets and polite society. A matching bonnet framed a face that was pale with exhaustion, but her chin was held at an angle of determined hope. Her hair, what he could see of it peeking from beneath the bonnet, was the color of spun honey. She clutched a small, worn valise in her other hand as if it were her only anchor in this strange new sea. She stepped onto the platform and took a slow, deep breath, her eyes scanning the small crowd with a look of nervous anticipation. Caleb found himself frozen for a moment, an observer against his own volition. He saw the hope in her eyes, the vulnerability in the straight line of her back. She was looking for someone. Her gaze passed over the faces, searching, and then a small frown creased her brow. The crowd began to disperse, people collecting their parcels or greeting familiar faces, but the woman in the blue dress remained, her solitary figure growing more conspicuous with each passing second. The station master, a harried man named Henderson, was busy unloading freight. She approached him, her posture still radiating a fragile confidence. Caleb could not hear their words, but he could read the story in their gestures. He saw her ask a question, her expression open and hopeful. He saw Henderson shake his head, consult a clipboard, and shake his head again, this time with an air of finality. He watched as the woman's shoulders, which had been held so straight, began to slump. The hope in her eyes flickered and died, replaced by a dawning, gut-wrenching panic. She said something else, her voice likely pleading now, and Henderson just shrugged, a gesture of helpless pity, before turning back to his work. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. Caleb felt a familiar, unwelcome pang in his chest. It was pity, an emotion he had long ago deemed useless. He turned away, his jaw tight. It was not his concern. He had his own life to manage, his own ghost to keep at bay. He took a step toward the general store, his mission clear. But then he glanced back. He saw two rough-looking men from the saloon step onto the boardwalk, their eyes fixed on the woman. He saw the predatory way they looked at her fine clothes and her obvious vulnerability. They exchanged a low murmur and a smirk. In that moment, she was no longer just a stranger in a predicament. She was a lamb surrounded by wolves. He cursed under his breath, a low, harsh sound. His code of non-involvement warred with a deeper, more ingrained instinct, the one that compelled a man to stand between danger and the defenseless. The ghost of Sarah's voice whispered in his memory, a gentle chiding about his better nature. With a sigh of profound resignation, he abandoned his trip to the store and started across the dusty street. Eleanor Vance felt the world tilting beneath her feet. The ground, which she had so longed to feel after days on the rattling train, now seemed unstable, ready to give way. The letter in her reticule felt like a hot coal against her hip. It had been so clear, so promising. Mr. Alastair Peterson, a respectable widower with a modest ranch, sought a wife to share his life and build a future in the promising Wyoming territory. His letters had been articulate, kind, and filled with descriptions of the beautiful, wild country. He had promised to meet her at the station in Redemption. But Mr. Peterson was not here. According to the station master, no one by that name lived anywhere near Redemption. No one was expecting her. The letter, the ticket he had sent, the entire foundation of her desperate hope, it was all a lie. A cruel, elaborate hoax. The last of her money had been spent on the journey. She had sold nearly everything she owned after her parents' passing, leaving a life of quiet refinement in Philadelphia for a future she now realized was a phantom. The panic that had been a small, cold knot in her stomach was now a roaring fire, threatening to consume her. What was she to do? Where was she to go? She could feel the eyes on her, the curious glances of the townswomen, the far more unsettling stares of the men lounging outside the saloon. She pulled her worn wool shawl tighter around her shoulders, a flimsy defense against the sudden, biting chill of fear. She felt terribly, foolishly conspicuous in her blue dress, a beacon of helplessness. The sun was beginning to dip toward the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, but the beauty of it was lost on her. The lengthening shadows felt like grasping fingers. "You need help?" The voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It came from directly behind her, and she jumped, spinning around with a small, startled gasp. The man standing before her was as much a part of the landscape as the mountains themselves. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dusty, practical clothes. His face was all harsh angles and shadow, his eyes a startling, stormy gray that seemed to see right through her carefully composed exterior. There was an aura of formidable stillness about him, a quiet power that was both intimidating and, strangely, reassuring. I beg your pardon?" she stammered, her voice thinner than she would have liked. "You're looking for someone who isn't here," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "You've been deceived." The words were blunt, devoid of pity, but they were also honest, cutting through the fog of her panic with their stark truth. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, and she fought them back with a ferocity born of pride and terror. "I am perfectly fine, thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. My escort has simply been delayed." The man's expression did not change. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible glance toward the saloon, where the two men were still watching her with undisguised interest. "Night will be here soon," he said, his gaze returning to her. "This is not a place for a woman to be alone after dark with nowhere to go." The truth of his words settled over her like a shroud. She had nowhere to go. No money for a room at the town's single, disreputable-looking hotel, and no way to pay for a ticket back east. She was trapped. The carefully constructed dam of her composure finally broke, and a single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She hastily wiped it away. The man let out a soft, weary sigh. "I have a ranch a few miles from here. My housekeeper, Martha, is there. You can have a room for the night. We can figure things out in the morning." Eleanor stared at him, her mind racing. He was a complete stranger, a hard-looking man in a hard-looking land. Every lesson she had ever been taught screamed at her to refuse to run. But where would she run? To the men at the saloon? To the cold, indifferent street? She looked into his eyes again. They were wary, guarded, but she saw no hint of the predatory gleam she had seen in the other men's eyes. What she saw was a deep, profound weariness, and something else, a reluctant decency. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help me?" He seemed to consider the question for a long moment. "Because my mother raised me better than to leave a woman stranded," he said finally, his voice flat. It was the simplest of answers, and yet it felt like the truest thing she had heard all day. Her choices were to trust this formidable stranger or face the unknown dangers of the night alone. Looking at the steady resolve in his face, she made her decision. "All right," she said, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." He gave a curt nod, the matter settled. "I'm Caleb Thorne." "Eleanor Vance," she replied, offering her name into the growing twilight. Without another word, he picked up her valise as if it weighed nothing and turned, expecting her to follow. As she fell in a step behind him, walking toward the large roan horse tied to the post. She felt as if she were stepping off a cliff into a deep, unknown canyon. She had come west seeking a future, and in the space of an afternoon, it had dissolved into dust. Now, her life, her safety, was in the hands of a stranger named Caleb Thorne, a man who looked as wild and untamed as the territory itself. The ride to the ranch was a journey into deepening shadow. Eleanor rode Atlas, her valise tied behind the saddle, while Caleb walked alongside, his hand resting lightly on the bridle, guiding the horse with an easy, practiced familiarity. The silence between them was vast and heavy, filled only by the clip-clop of the horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth and the ever-present whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. Eleanor, accustomed to the constant clamor of the city, found the silence unnerving. It seemed to amplify the frantic beating of her own heart. She studied the man walking beside her. His profile was stark against the fading light, a silhouette of rugged self-sufficiency. He moved with a quiet economy, his long strides eating up the ground. He had not offered any more information about himself, nor had he asked for any more from her. His offer of help seemed to be a transaction he had felt obligated to make, and now he was simply seeing it through. She felt like a piece of freight he was reluctantly transporting. The thought should have been insulting, but she was too consumed by fear and exhaustion to feel anything but a fragile, desperate gratitude. As darkness fell completely, the landscape transformed. The mountains became hulking, black shapes against a sky awash with an impossible number of stars. The world was reduced to silver and black, beautiful and terrifying in its immense scale. She had read about the grandeur of the West in books, but the reality was overwhelming, making her feel small and utterly insignificant. After what felt like an eternity, a light appeared in the distance, a single, warm pinprick in the vast darkness. As they drew closer, it resolved into a lantern hanging by the door of a log house. The structure was larger than she had expected, solid and imposing. It was not a house so much as a fortress, built to withstand the elements and whatever else this land could throw at it. A barn and several corrals stood nearby, dark shapes against the star-dusted sky. As they reached the house, the door opened, spilling a rectangle of golden light onto the porch. An older woman stood silhouetted in the doorway, her hair a cloud of white, her frame sturdy. "Caleb, that you?" she called out, her voice warm and practical. "It's me, Martha," Caleb called back. "We have a guest." The woman, Martha, squinted into the darkness, her eyes landing on Eleanor. There was a moment of surprise. Then her expression softened with a look of immediate understanding and compassion. Caleb helped Eleanor dismount, his large hands closing briefly around her waist to steady her as her feet touched the ground. The brief, impersonal contact sent a strange jolt through her, a startling reminder of his physical presence. She stumbled slightly, her legs stiff from the ride, and his grip tightened for a second to keep her from falling. "This is Miss Eleanor Vance," Caleb said, his voice as flat as ever. "She'll be staying the night." Martha stepped onto the porch and enveloped Eleanor in a surprising, comforting hug. "You poor dear," she murmured, her voice smelling of flour and wood smoke. "You look half frozen and completely worn out. Come inside, come inside. Never you mind him," she added, gesturing a thumb toward Caleb. "He has all the social graces of a grumpy bear, but his heart's in the right place, even if he keeps it locked up tight." Eleanor felt a fresh wave of tears threaten, but these were tears of relief. The simple, unconditional kindness of this woman was a balm to her frayed nerves. She allowed Martha to lead her inside, into a large main room that was simple, clean, and warmed by a large stone fireplace where a low fire crackled merrily. The furniture was handmade and sturdy, softened by a few woven rugs and handmade quilts. It was a man's home, functional and spare, but Martha's presence had clearly added touches of warmth and comfort. "I'll show you to a room where you can freshen up," Martha said, guiding her down a short hallway. "Dinner is almost ready. Nothing fancy, just stew, but it'll warm you up." The room was small and sparsely furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single wooden chair. But the bed was covered with a thick, colorful quilt, and the room was impeccably clean. For the first time since stepping off the train, Eleanor felt a flicker of safety. She washed the dust from her face and hands, the cold water a shock that helped to clear her head. Looking at her reflection in the small, wavy mirror, she saw a stranger, a pale, wide-eyed woman on the verge of shattering. She took a deep breath, straightened her dress, and forced herself to walk back out into the main room. Dinner was a quiet affair. Caleb ate with a focused intensity, as if it were another task to be completed. Martha kept up a gentle stream of chatter, talking about the goings-on at the ranch, a cow that was close to calving, a fox that had been sniffing around the chicken coop. It was clear she was trying to put Eleanor at ease, to fill the heavy silence that Caleb seemed to cultivate. Eleanor, for her part, tried to eat, but the hearty beef stew tasted like ash in her mouth. Her appetite was a casualty of the day's turmoil. After the meal, Martha shooed them both out of the kitchen. "You two go sit by the fire," she ordered. "I'll handle this." Eleanor hesitated, but Caleb was already moving toward the hearth, so she followed, perching uncertainly on the edge of a worn armchair. Caleb took the chair opposite, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his rugged features, making him look even more formidable. He stared into the flames, his expression unreadable, the silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. "Thank you," Eleanor said finally, her voice small in the quiet room, "for your hospitality. Both you and Martha have been incredibly kind." Caleb didn't look at her. He picked up a poker and nudged a log, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "Martha's kind," he corrected, his voice low. "I'm just practical." "Is it practical to bring a complete stranger into your home?" she challenged gently. This time, he did look at her, his gray eyes meeting hers across the hearth. "It's more practical than leaving you to the alternative." His gaze held hers for a long moment, and she had the distinct feeling that he was weighing and measuring her, trying to understand the nature of the disruption she represented. To her own surprise, she found herself wanting to explain, to make him understand that she wasn't a fool, merely a victim of circumstance and her own desperate hope. "I had letters," she began, her voice gaining a little strength, "from a man named Alistair Peterson. He paid for my ticket. He wrote of a life here, a home. My parents passed away last year. There was nothing left for me in Philadelphia. I thought," her voice broke, "I thought this was a chance for a new beginning." She expected a cynical remark, or perhaps no response at all. Instead, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not pity, but a shared, shadowed understanding. He looked back into the fire, his jaw working for a moment before he spoke. His voice, when it came, was quieter, rougher, as if dragged up from a great depth. "This land doesn't give new beginnings," he said softly. "It just offers a place to survive what's come before." He paused, and the silence that followed was different. It was filled with the weight of unspoken history. "I had a beginning here once," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "A wife, Sarah, a son, Samuel." Eleanor held her breath, knowing she was standing on sacred, wounded ground. "They're buried on the hill behind this house," he finished, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, a deliberate emptiness that was more heartbreaking than any tears. "A fever took them 5 years ago." He said it like a verdict, a final, unchangeable fact that had reshaped his entire world. The fortress of his silence had been breached, not by her questions, but by the simple, honest sharing of her own loss. In that moment, he was no longer just the intimidating stranger who had rescued her. He was a man who understood grief, a man whose solitude was not a preference, but a scar. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words utterly inadequate. He gave a short, sharp nod, a dismissal of her sympathy and an end to the conversation. He stood up abruptly. "Martha has your room ready. You should get some rest." He turned and walked out of the room, disappearing down the hallway to his own quarters, leaving her alone by the fire with the echo of his confession and the sudden, startling realization that the wall between them, which had seemed miles thick, was perhaps not made of stone after all, but of ice that had just begun to crack. The next morning, Eleanor awoke to the scent of coffee and frying bacon. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The unfamiliar room, the profound quiet outside her window, the scent of wood smoke baked into the very walls. It all rushed back to her. With it came the full weight of her predicament. She was a charity case, a burden on a grieving man and his kind housekeeper. The thought was intolerable. She dressed quickly and found her way to the kitchen, where Martha was humming softly as she turned bacon in a cast-iron skillet. The older woman smiled warmly at her. "Sleep well, dear." "Yes, thank you," Eleanor lied. In truth, she had tossed and turned, her mind a maelstrom of fear and uncertainty. "Mr. Thorne is already outside," Martha said, nodding toward the window. "He's been up since before dawn. The man works as if he's trying to outrun his own shadow." Eleanor looked out and saw Caleb in the corral, working with a young, unbroken horse. He moved with a quiet confidence, his voice low and steady as he spoke to the nervous animal. There was a patience in his movements, a gentle authority that stood in stark contrast to his gruff demeanor with people. She watched, mesmerized, as the horse, initially skittish, began to calm under his hand, its ears pricking forward, its body relaxing. He was not breaking the horse's spirit, she realized, but earning its trust. "I cannot impose on you any longer," Eleanor said, turning back to Martha, her resolve hardening. "I must find work. Is there any in redemption? A governess, a seamstress, anything?" Martha's smile faded. "Jobs for women are scarce here, child. And the kind of men who be hiring, well, they're not the kind of men you'd want to be working for." Her meaning was clear. "You're safe here. Caleb won't turn you out." "I will not accept charity," Eleanor insisted, her pride a fierce, burning thing. "I will earn my keep. I can cook, I can clean, I can mend. I may not know how to work on a ranch, but I am a fast learner." When Caleb came in for breakfast, his face and hands clean, but his clothes still carrying the scent of horse and hay, Eleanor was ready. She stood straighter, her hands clasped in front of her. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice formal, "I'm deeply grateful for your help, but I cannot stay here as a guest. I wish to work to pay for my room and board until I can find a permanent situation." Caleb paused in the act of pouring himself a cup of coffee. He looked at her, his gray eyes assessing. He saw not the frightened, helpless woman from the day before, but a woman of resolve. He saw the steel beneath the fine wool. A flicker of something, perhaps respect, passed through his gaze. He had expected tears and helplessness. He had not expected this determined pride. "What can you do?" he asked, his tone practical, challenging. "I can assist Martha in the house," she said. "I can tend a garden. I can learn whatever you are willing to teach me. I will not be a burden." He considered her for a long moment, the silence stretching. He thought of the endless, quiet days, the routine that was both his comfort and his cage. This woman, with her Eastern manners and her surprising grit, was a disruption to it all. Part of him wanted to send her back to town on the next supply wagon to restore the silence. But another part, the part that had watched her stand her ground, was intrigued. And the part that remembered the predatory looks of the men in the saloon knew Martha was right. Sending her away alone was not an option. "Fine," he said at last, the word clipped. "Martha can always use the help. And the vegetable garden needs weeding." He sat down at the table and began to eat. The matter settled. But as he ate, he was acutely aware of her presence, a new and unsettling element in his ordered world. He was beginning to see that Eleanor Vance was not the delicate, fragile thing he had first assumed. She was more like the wildflowers that grew in the high meadows, seemingly delicate, but with roots tough enough to cling to the hard, rocky soil. The days that followed fell into a strange new rhythm. Eleanor became Martha's shadow, learning the domestic workings of the ranch. She scrubbed floors, kneaded bread dough until her arms ached, and spent hours on her knees in the vegetable garden under the hot Wyoming sun, pulling weeds with a determined thoroughness. Her fine dresses were packed away, replaced by a simple, practical work dress Martha had altered for her. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to embroidery needles, quickly became chapped and calloused. Yet, with every blister, she felt a growing sense of satisfaction. She was earning her place. Caleb watched her from a distance. He saw her struggle to lift a heavy bucket of water and refuse his silent offer of help. He saw her talking to the chickens as she scattered their feed, a small, genuine smile on her face. He saw the exhaustion in her posture at the end of the day, but also the quiet pride. His initial assessment of her as a liability was being steadily dismantled. He found himself listening for the sound of her voice in the house, a low murmur as she spoke with Martha, or the soft notes she sometimes hummed as she worked. These small sounds began to fill the silence he had once cultivated, and to his astonishment, he did not resent them. One evening, after dinner, he found her on the porch, a book open in her lap, though she was not reading. She was watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of rose and violet. He had intended to walk past her to check on the livestock, but he found himself stopping. "It's beautiful," she said, without looking at him. "So vast. It makes you feel small." "It's meant to," he replied, leaning against a porch post. "Remind a man of his place." "And what is a man's place here?" she asked, turning to look at him, her expression serious. "To hold on," he said simply. "To endure. Is that all there is?" "Endurance?" she pressed, her question a gentle challenge to his bleak philosophy. "Is there no room for joy?" The question struck him with unexpected force. Joy was a foreign word, a concept from a life he no longer lived. He thought of Sarah's laugh, of the simple happiness of holding his son. "Joy is a luxury," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Out here, it's a fire that burns too bright. It attracts trouble." She looked down at her hands, now reddened and rough from her work. "Perhaps," she said softly, "or perhaps it's the only thing that makes the endurance worthwhile." Her words lingered in the air between them, unsettling him. She saw the world differently. Where he saw only the potential for loss, she still looked for the possibility of joy. He saw her resilience not as mere survival, but as an active, hopeful choice. He was beginning to realize that the kindness he saw in her was not a weakness, but a form of strength he had long forgotten. And she, in turn, was beginning to see past his formidable, silent exterior to the honorable, wounded man beneath. In the shared quiet of the evenings and the unspoken respect of their daily work, a fragile bridge was being built between their two disparate worlds. News like dust traveled fast in a place like redemption. The story of the beautiful woman from the East, deceived by a phantom suitor and now living out at the reclusive Caleb Thorne's ranch, was the most tantalizing piece of gossip the town had seen in years. When Caleb rode into town for supplies a week later, he felt the weight of curious and speculative stares. Sheriff Brody met him outside the general store, his expression wry. "Quite the stir you've caused, Caleb," the sheriff said, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Taken an astray, have you?" "She needed help," Caleb said, his voice low and clipped, a clear warning not to press the matter. "I'm sure she did," Brody said, his tone becoming more serious. "Just be watchful." A couple of hard-looking strangers were in town the day she arrived, asking questions about a woman matching her description. Said they were hired by her family to find her. Caleb's body went still. "Her family is gone." The sheriff nodded slowly. "That's what I figured. They were working for someone else. They smelled of trouble and money." They mentioned a name. Blackwood. The name hit Caleb like a physical blow. Silas Blackwood, a wealthy, ruthless cattle baron who owned the vast territory to the north. For years, Blackwood had been trying to buy Caleb's land, not for the grazing, but for the deep year-round creek that cut through it, the most reliable water source for 50 miles. Caleb had always refused. Blackwood was not a man who took no for an answer. "What does Blackwood want with her?" Caleb asked, his mind racing, connecting dots he hadn't even seen before. "My guess. He saw her arrive, saw she was alone and connected to you. He sees a weakness, Caleb, a lever to use against you," Brody said grimly. "He probably paid some lowlife to send that fake letter and get her out here, to create a problem for you, a distraction, or worse. A cold fury, colder and harder than the Wyoming winter, settled in Caleb's gut. The idea that Blackwood had orchestrated Eleanor's suffering, had used her hope and desperation as a weapon against him, was monstrous. His protective instinct, already awakened, now roared to life. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She was under his care, and Blackwood had just made her a target. "Thank you, Brody," Caleb said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. He gathered his supplies with a grim efficiency and rode back to the ranch. The idyllic peace of the last few days shattered. The world had intruded, just as he had always feared it would. He didn't tell Eleanor what he had learned. He didn't want to frighten her. Instead, his vigilance sharpened. He became her shadow, always seeming to be nearby whenever she was outside. If she went to the garden, he would find a fence post to mend nearby. If she walked down to the creek, he would follow at a distance, his rifle never far from his hand. Eleanor noticed the change immediately. The comfortable distance he had maintained was gone, replaced by a watchful, hovering presence that made her uneasy. "Is something wrong, Mr. Thorne?" she asked one afternoon as he appeared at her side, while she was collecting eggs from the chicken coop. "Stay closer to the house," he said, his voice terse, his eyes scanning the horizon. He didn't answer her question. His overprotectiveness was beginning to feel stifling. It felt as if he had put her back in the category of a helpless burden, erasing the respect she had worked so hard to earn. A small seed of resentment began to take root. She didn't understand that his constant presence was not a sign of her weakness, but a measure of his growing fear for her safety. The first direct threat came a few days later. Eleanor, seeking a few moments of solitude, had wandered a little farther than usual, finding a small, sun-dappled clearing where she sat to sketch the wildflowers in a small notebook she had kept. The sound of approaching horses made her look up. Two men, the same rough-looking pair Caleb had seen in the saloon, reined in their horses a few yards away. Their eyes were hard, their smiles unpleasant. "Well, now, look what we have here," the first man said, his voice oily. "A pretty little bird, far from her cage." Eleanor's heart leaped in her throat. She stood up slowly, her sketchbook forgotten on the ground. "I am on private property," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "You should leave." "We just want to talk," the second man said, dismounting and taking a step toward her. "We hear you're looking for a way back east. Our employer, he's a generous man. He'd be willing to help you out. Pay for your ticket, and then some. All you'd have to do is convince that stubborn mule Thorne to sell his land." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't about her family. It was about the ranch. It was about Caleb. "I have no intention of leaving," she said, her fear giving way to a spark of defiance. "And I will not be a part of your scheme." The man's smile vanished. He took another step closer, his hand reaching for her. "I don't think you're in a position to be making demands, Missy." "She is," a cold voice cut through the air. "And I am." Both men froze, turning to see Caleb emerge from the trees, his rifle held loosely in his arms, its muzzle pointed at the ground but ready to be raised in an instant. His face was a mask of cold fury, his gray eyes like chips of ice. "This is my land," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She is under my protection. Get on your horse and ride out. If I ever see either of you on my property again, I will not give a second warning." There was no question that he meant it. The air crackled with menace. The second man slowly backed away, his eyes never leaving Caleb's, and remounted his horse. Without another word, they wheeled their mounts around and galloped away. The moment they were gone, the strength drained from Eleanor's legs. She swayed, and Caleb was there in two long strides, his hand closing around her arm to steady her. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough with concern. "No," she whispered, her body trembling. "Just frightened." His grip on her arm gentled. "I told you to stay close to the house." The words were an accusation, but the fear in his eyes told a different story. He was not angry at her. He was terrified for her. Looking at him, at the fierce, protective fire in his gaze, she finally understood. His hovering wasn't about her weakness. It was about his fear of losing something he was just beginning to realize he valued. The confrontation with Blackwood's men was a turning point. The illusion of peace was gone, replaced by a constant, humming tension. The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was real, and it was at their doorstep. That night, after Martha had gone to bed, Caleb finally told Eleanor everything about Silas Blackwood, the water rights, and Sheriff Brody's suspicion that her entire journey had been a pawn in Blackwood's cruel game. Hearing it all laid out, Eleanor felt a fresh wave of sickness and anger. To have her hopes and dreams manipulated for such a base purpose was a profound violation. But her anger was not just for herself. It was for Caleb. Blackwood had not just targeted him. He had desecrated the memory of her own loss and desperation. "He will not win," she said, her voice low and fierce, surprising them both. "We will not let him." Caleb looked at her, truly looked at her, in the flickering firelight. She had said we. The word hung in the air, a small, solid thing. He was no longer fighting this battle alone. In that moment, the wall he had so carefully maintained around his heart crumbled a little more. He had brought her here to protect her from the world, and now she was standing beside him, ready to face it with him. Blackwood, frustrated by the failure of his men, decided to escalate. His goal was no longer just intimidation. It was ruin. A few nights later, under the thin light of a crescent moon, they struck again. Eleanor was woken from a restless sleep by a sound she couldn't place, a low, rumbling thunder when there were no clouds in the sky. Then came a shout from outside, Caleb's voice, sharp with alarm. She threw on a robe and rushed to the window. In the dim light, she could see a chaotic scene unfolding. A large portion of Caleb's cattle, which had been grazing in the lower pasture, were being driven in a frantic, panicked stampede directly toward the ravine at the edge of his property. Two riders, dark figures against the landscape, were firing shots into the air, keeping the terrified animals running toward their doom. Losing those cattle would be a devastating financial blow, perhaps one Caleb could not recover from. She saw Caleb race from the barn, already on Atlas's back, a rifle in his hand. He was one man against two, trying to turn a herd of hundreds of panicked animals. It was an impossible task. Without a second thought, Eleanor ran from the house. Martha tried to stop her, but she shook her head. "He needs help." She ran to the corral where her own horse, a gentle mare Caleb had given her to ride, was stabled. Her hands fumbled with the saddle straps in her haste, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had only been riding for a few weeks and never at a gallop, never in the dark. But fear for Caleb overrode her own. She hauled herself into the saddle and urged the mare into a run, following the sound of the chaos. When she reached the pasture, the scene was even worse than she had imagined. The cattle were a roiling sea of horns and hooves, their bellows of terror filling the night. Caleb was riding hard along the edge of the herd, trying to get ahead of them to turn the lead animals. One of Blackwood's men saw her approach and wheeled his horse toward her, a cruel grin on his face. "Looky here, the little lady wants to play cowboy," he sneered, raising his pistol. Caleb saw the movement. "Eleanor, get back," he roared, his voice filled with terror. He fired a shot over the man's head, forcing him to duck and swerve, giving Eleanor a precious few seconds. She didn't retreat. She remembered something Caleb had told her, a story about how his father had once stopped a stampede by waving a blanket, creating a visual barrier the lead steer wouldn't cross. Her shawl, it was still wrapped around her shoulders. She pulled it off, the fine wool a flimsy weapon against the tide of flesh and bone. Following Caleb's shouted, frantic instructions, she rode to a narrow point ahead of the herd, just before the ravine. "Wave it! Make yourself big!" he yelled. Her horse shied, terrified of the noise and confusion, but she held on, her knuckles white on the reins. As the lead steers bore down on her, a wall of panic and muscle, she stood up in her stirrups and waved the shawl with all her might, screaming until her throat was raw. For a terrifying second, she thought they would trample her. The lead bull, its eyes wide with terror, was only yards away. But then it saw the unexpected, frightening movement. It faltered, turning aside from the flapping barrier. The animals directly behind it followed its lead, and the whole terrifying momentum of the herd began to shift, turning away from the ravine's edge. Working together, she and Caleb managed to push the herd back, turning the stampede into a confused milling. The two rustlers, their plan foiled, fired a few parting shots and melted back into the darkness. The immediate danger was over. The rumbling of hooves subsided, replaced by the heaving breaths of men and horses and the low, nervous sounds of the unsettled cattle. Caleb rode up to her, his face pale in the moonlight. He swung down from Atlas and pulled her from her saddle, his hands gripping her shoulders, his whole body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "Are you all right? What in God's name were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice a raw, ragged mixture of anger and profound relief. "I was thinking you needed help," she said, her own voice trembling. He stared at her disheveled hair, the dirt on her cheek, the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. He saw the brave, reckless, incredible woman who had ridden into chaos to stand with him. All the anger drained out of him, replaced by an emotion so powerful it stole his breath. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in a desperate, crushing embrace, burying his face in her hair. "You fool," he whispered, his voice thick. "You absolute, beautiful fool." She clung to him, feeling the frantic beat of his heart against hers. In the middle of the dark, chaotic pasture, surrounded by the wreckage of Blackwood's attack, something had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer just her protector, and she was no longer just his charge. They were partners. And in that shared danger, under the cold Wyoming moon, the fragile bridge between them had been forged into something unbreakable. The aftermath of the stampede left a heavy pall over the ranch. Though they had saved the herd, the brazenness of the attack left no doubt as to Blackwood's intentions. He would not stop until he had what he wanted, and Caleb knew the next time would be even more violent. The fear he felt was no longer a distant, abstract thing. It was a living entity, a cold presence that sat beside him at the dinner table and followed him through his daily chores. And it was centered entirely on Eleanor. He watched her moving about the house, her hands busy with some task, a quiet song on her lips, and a terrifying image would flash through his mind. Eleanor caught in the crossfire, Eleanor hurt, Eleanor gone. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting agony in his chest that was terrifyingly familiar. It was the same fear he had lived with when Sarah was sick, the same helpless terror. He had sworn he would never feel again. He had built his entire solitary life on the foundation of that promise to himself. His love for her, and he could no longer deny that was what it was, had become a source of profound torment. It was a gaping weakness in his armor, a vulnerability Blackwood had already proven he was willing to exploit. The only logical solution, the only way he could ensure her safety, was to remove her from the equation. He had to send her away. The decision was a shard of ice in his heart, but he clung to it with the grim determination of a surgeon performing a necessary amputation. He would be saving her. He would be protecting her from the violence that was coming. The silence would return to his house, the solitude to his life, and she would be safe. The cost to his own heart was irrelevant. He found her on the porch that evening, watching the last light fade from the sky. He had been avoiding being alone with her since the stampede, the memory of holding her, the scent of her hair, the terrifying strength of his feelings, all too raw. He stood behind her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You need to leave, Eleanor," he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. He had practiced the tone, stripping it of the agony he felt. She turned, her expression confused, hurt. "What are you talking about?" "The stagecoach leaves for Cheyenne in 2 days. From there, you can get a train back east," he continued, his gaze fixed on a point over her shoulder. He couldn't look at her. "I'll give you the money for the ticket. Enough to get you started again in Philadelphia." The hurt in her eyes was quickly being replaced by a dawning, wounded anger. "Leave? Why? I thought, after the other night, I thought we were a team. I thought I belonged here." "You don't belong here," he said, and the words were like swallowing broken glass. "This is my fight. You are a complication I don't need. You've been nothing but trouble since you arrived. Each word was a deliberate cruelty, a lie designed to push her away, to make her want to leave, to sever the bond between them so cleanly that she would not look back. He saw the impact of his words as surely as if he had struck her. The light in her eyes dimmed, the color drained from her face. She looked at him, searching his face for some sign that he didn't mean it. But he kept his expression a cold, impenetrable mask. He was breaking her heart to save her life, and it was destroying him. "I see," she said, her voice a brittle whisper. She drew herself up, her pride a shield against the pain he was inflicting. I apologize for being a burden. I misunderstood. Of course, I will leave. I will be ready in the morning." She turned and walked back into the house without another word, her back ramrod straight, leaving him alone on the porch with the ruins of what they had built. The silence he had so desperately craved rushed back in, but it was no longer peaceful. It was a vast, crushing emptiness, filled with the echo of her quiet, heartbroken voice. The next day was an exercise in misery. The air in the house was thick with unspoken words and agonizing restraint. Eleanor moved with a quiet, dignified sorrow, packing her few belongings into her valise. She spoke only to Martha, her voice polite and distant. She did not look at Caleb, did not acknowledge his presence. To him, it was as if she had already become a ghost. Martha shot him looks that could have curdled milk, her disapproval a palpable force in the room, but she said nothing, respecting Eleanor's pained silence. Caleb spent the day working himself to the point of exhaustion, mending fences on the far side of his property, anything to be away from the house, away from the sight of her preparing to leave his life forever. He told himself it was for the best. He repeated it like a mantra. She would be safe. That was all that mattered. But his heart called him a liar and a fool. That night, the final night, was the longest of his life. He lay awake in his bed, staring into the darkness, listening to the silence of the house. It was the same silence he had lived in for 5 years, but now it was unbearable. It was not the absence of sound. It was the absence of her. He could hear her in the next room, the soft creak of the floorboards as she paced, and he knew she was not sleeping either. He had done this. He had shattered her resilience, had taken the hope she had so carefully rebuilt and ground it into dust. Just before dawn, as the first pale light began to touch the eastern sky, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was not the wind. It was the soft crunch of a boot on gravel, just outside the house. Then another. He was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers and grabbing the rifle he always kept by his bed. He moved silently to his window, peering out into the pre-dawn gloom. He saw them, 4 figures, moving like shadows, converging on the house from different directions. Blackwood. He hadn't even waited for Eleanor to leave. He had come to finish it. A gunshot shattered the morning stillness, splintering the wood of the window frame next to Caleb's head. The attack had begun. "Martha! Eleanor! Get down!" he roared, his voice a thunderclap in the quiet house. He heard a cry of alarm from Eleanor's room. Then Martha's voice, sharp and commanding. "Get away from the window, child." On the floor, Caleb returned fire, using the window frame for cover. Another shot came from a barn. They were surrounded. He was trapped, outnumbered. His first thought was of Eleanor. He had to get her out. He had pushed her away, and now his callous attempt to save her had led her directly into the heart of the fire. He ran from his room, his mind racing. "Eleanor," he yelled. She appeared in the hallway, her face pale, but her eyes wide and clear, not with panic, but with a fierce, focused intensity. She was not crying. She was not cowering. She was ready. "The back door," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Get to the trees. Run and don't look back." "I am not leaving you," she said, her voice ringing with a strength that stunned him. The hurt he had inflicted was gone, burned away by the immediate life-or-death reality of the moment. "Damn it, Eleanor, do as I say," he snarled, his fear for her making his voice harsh. "No," she said simply. "You told me I don't belong here. You were wrong. My fight is with you. Tell me what to do." A bullet ripped through the wall nearby, showering them with splinters. There was no more time for argument. He looked at her, at the unwavering resolve in her face, and he saw not a liability, but an ally. His partner. "The spare rifle," he said, nodding toward the heavy Winchester mounted over the fireplace. "In the study. Barricade the door. Martha, stay with her." As Martha and Eleanor scrambled for the study, Caleb took up a position by the main room window, trading shots with the men outside. He was a skilled marksman, and he made them keep their heads down, but he knew he couldn't hold them off forever. They would try to burn him out. In the study, Eleanor's hands did not tremble as she took down the heavy rifle. She had watched Caleb clean it. He had even, one afternoon, shown her how to load it, just in case she fumbled for a moment with the cartridges, her fingers clumsy with haste, but then the mechanism clicked into place. She was loaded. Martha, her face grim, was dragging a heavy desk in front of the door. The firefight raged. Glass shattered as a bullet took out the main room window. Caleb felt a searing pain in his arm as a splinter of wood flew past, gashing his skin. He ignored it. He could hear Blackwood's men shouting to each other, their positions. One was trying to get to the back of the house, the study. He heard a crash from that direction, the sound of a window breaking. "Eleanor!" he yelled in terror. He heard a man's grunt of surprise, then the deafening roar of the Winchester rifle, fired from within the study. It was followed by a heavy thud. Eleanor had fired. She had shot the man trying to climb through the window. The sheer, stunning courage of her act gave Caleb a surge of adrenaline. He was not alone. He had an army of 2 women at his back. He moved to the doorway, laying down, covering fire, trying to push the remaining attackers back. But there were still too many. One of them had managed to get onto the porch right under the front window. Caleb couldn't get a clear shot. The man was preparing to throw a lit torch onto the dry wood of the porch. Suddenly, the front door flew open. Caleb spun, thinking they had been breached, but it was Eleanor. Before he could scream at her to get back, she swung a heavy iron fire poker with all her might, striking the man on the porch squarely in the back of the head. He crumpled without a sound, the torch rolling harmlessly away. Now there were 2 left, one by the barn, and Silas Blackwood himself, who was using the corner of the corral for cover. Caleb saw his chance. He burst out the front door, his rifle at his shoulder, charging directly at Blackwood. It was a reckless, desperate move. Blackwood, surprised, raised his own rifle. Both men fired at the same time. Caleb felt a white-hot agony tear through his side. He staggered, but his own shot had found its mark. Blackwood cried out, dropping his rifle and clutching at his shoulder, his face a mask of rage and pain. Caleb pushed through the fire in his side, closing the distance between them. The fight devolved into a brutal, close-quarter struggle. Caleb, wounded and bleeding, fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf, his fists striking with punishing force. He was fighting not just for his land anymore. He was fighting for his home. He was fighting for her. He landed a final, desperate blow, and Blackwood went down, unconscious. The last remaining gunman, seeing his boss fall, lost his nerve. He fired one last wild shot and fled on his horse. And then there was silence. A stunning, ringing silence, broken only by Caleb's own ragged breathing. He leaned against the corral fence, the world tilting, his side a universe of pain. He looked back at the house, at the smoke-wreathed porch, and saw Eleanor standing in the doorway, the fire poker still clutched in her hand, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide with fear and relief. She was alive. She was safe. He tried to take a step toward her, but his legs gave out. He slid down the fence post, his vision blurring at the edges. Eleanor cried out his name and ran to him, falling to her knees at his side. "Caleb, oh God, you're hurt." Her hands hovered over the bleeding wound in his side, her face a canvas of anguish. "It's all right," he gasped, the words costing him. He reached up, his hand shaking, and cupped her cheek. He looked into her eyes, and all the walls, all the lies, all the fear that had made him push her away, crumbled into dust. All that was left was the raw, undeniable, world-altering truth. "I told you to leave," he whispered, his voice thick with regret. Tears streamed down her face, washing clean paths through the soot. I know, she choked out. I was going to. I'll be gone as soon as you're well. She started to turn away, to give him space, to follow the path he had so cruelly laid out for her. No, his grip on her cheek tightened, holding her there. His gaze was fierce, desperate. Don't go. The words were a prayer, a plea. I was a fool, a terrified fool. Pushing you away was the stupidest thing I've ever done. I was trying to protect you, but I was just protecting myself from feeling this. He took a ragged breath. The pain in his side, nothing compared to the pain of almost losing her. Tell me to stay, and I will, she had said in his mind, but now he knew what he had to say. Stay, Eleanor. Please. I love you. Stay, and make this empty place a home again. The confession hung in the air between them, more powerful than any gunshot. It was a surrender and a victory all at once. Through her tears, Eleanor's expression transformed. The pain and confusion were washed away by a dawning, brilliant joy. She leaned down and pressed her lips to his, a kiss filled with gunpowder, desperation, and the undeniable promise of a new beginning. I'm not going anywhere, she whispered against his mouth. I'm home. Sheriff Brody and a posse arrived less than an hour later, drawn by the echo of the sustained gunfire. They found a scene of carnage and resolution. Blackwood and his surviving men were bound and taken into custody, their reign of terror finally over. The sheriff looked at the bullet-riddled house, at the unconscious thug on the porch, and then at Caleb, who was being tended to by a grim-faced Martha and a tearful but resolute Eleanor. Looks like you handled things, Thorne, Brody said, a note of deep respect in his voice. We handled things, Caleb corrected, his gaze finding Eleanor's. The bullet had passed clean through, a painful but not life-threatening wound. The days that followed were a blur of recovery and quiet revelation. The physical pain in Caleb's side was a constant reminder of the battle they had fought and won, but it was eclipsed by a deeper, more profound healing. With Eleanor by his side, tending to his wound, reading to him in the long afternoons, the silence of the house was transformed. It was no longer an empty void, but a peaceful quiet, filled with the comfortable presence of the woman he loved. The ghosts of his past were still there, but they no longer haunted him. They were simply memories integrated into the man he was becoming. One afternoon, as he was finally able to sit on the porch again, he watched her watering the small patch of resilient flowers she had planted near the steps. She had brought life back not only to his house, but to him. He knew with an unshakable certainty what he had to do. He called her over. When she stood before him, he reached into the pocket of the shirt she had helped him into that morning. He pulled out a small, worn wooden box. He had retrieved it from the bottom of his trunk, from a place he hadn't dared to look in 5 years. Eleanor, he began, his voice rough with emotion. He opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a simple, slender gold band. This was my grandmother's wedding ring. My mother wore it, and then Sarah, he paused, taking a breath. It represents a lot of my past, a lot of love and a lot of loss. I thought I would never look at it again. He looked up at her, his gray eyes clear and full of love. But you are my future. You've shown me that a heart can heal, that a home can be rebuilt. I want to merge my past with our future. I want to build a life with you, right here, to face whatever comes. Together, he held the ring out to her. Eleanor Vance, will you marry me? Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of pure joy. She knelt before him, taking the hand that held the ring and closing her own around it. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with happiness. Oh, Caleb, yes. He slid the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly. It was a symbol not of replacing what was lost, but of building something new and beautiful upon the foundations of what had come before. When they next rode into redemption, it was not as a reclusive rancher and his mysterious charge, but as an engaged couple. The news had already preceded them. The initial gossip had transformed into a wave of genuine support and celebration. The townspeople, who had witnessed Blackwood's tyranny for years, saw Caleb and Eleanor as heroes. They came forward with offers of help to repair the ranch house, with gifts of pies and preserves, with simple, heartfelt congratulations. The community that Caleb had held at arm's length for so long now opened its arms to embrace them both. They were no longer outsiders, but the heart of a story of resilience and love that the whole town felt a part of. Their wedding, held a month later in the shade of the cottonwoods by the creek on their ranch, was attended by nearly everyone from Redemption, a joyful celebration of the new beginning they had fought so hard to win. 2 years later, the Wyoming wind still blew, but its voice no longer sounded of loneliness. It carried the scent of lavender from the flower boxes Eleanor had installed under every window, a sweet fragrance that mingled with the familiar pine and rich earth. The ranch had prospered. The herd was larger, the fences were strong, and a new wing had been added to the house, its fresh-cut logs a testament to growth and a shared future. Caleb rode in from the high pasture, the late afternoon sun warm on his back. The weariness in his muscles was a good, satisfying ache. As he approached the house, the sight that greeted him filled him with a quiet, profound joy that was now as familiar as breathing. Eleanor was on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair he had built for her, a child with a mop of dark, curly hair asleep in her lap. Their son, Daniel, was a year old, a perfect, miraculous blend of them both. Eleanor herself was softly rounded with the promise of their second child, due in the spring. She looked up as he approached, and her smile was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. It was a smile of deep, abiding peace and happiness. He swung down from Atlas, his movements still strong but gentler now, the hard edges of him softened by love. He came onto the porch and knelt before her, his calloused hand gently stroking his son's soft cheek. "He was a terror today," she said softly, her voice full of affection. "Wanted to chase the chickens all afternoon." Caleb chuckled, a low, warm sound that was heard often in the house now. He leaned in and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that spoke of shared days and quiet nights, of battles won and a life built together. He settled on the porch steps, leaning his back against the post, content to just sit in her presence. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her hand coming to rest on his shoulder. He looked out over his land. He saw the creek sparkling in the sun, the cattle grazing peacefully, the sturdy house that was no longer a fortress against the world, but a sanctuary filled with love and laughter. He thought of the man he had been, the solitary, wounded creature who believed survival meant being alone. He had been so wrong. His life hadn't ended 5 years before the train arrived. It had been waiting to begin. He turned his head, his weathered cheek pressing against her hand. He smiled, his gray eyes clear and bright. "I'm thinking," he said, his voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty, "that I'm home."